Hey y'all, so we're back reading Black Marxism. We are on part 3, Black Radicalism and Marxist Theory, chapter 10, C.L.R. James and the Black Radical Tradition, and the section that we're on is the theory of the Black Jacobin. So let's get started. The theory of the Black Jacobin. The 30s were rich in political dramas that might ground Black radical intelligentsias in their own historical traditions. Their indulgence in the militant rhetoric of the Western European left, evoking images of emergent revolutionary lower orders of its own, would have logically brought them to it eventually. For, in the older sense of the word, who was more proletarian than blacks in the imperialist and capitalist order? And I think about, like, for example, sharecroppers and domestic workers, like stuff like that. But in a different, though not unrelated, historical logic that was maturing, but it was a different, though not unrelated, historical logic that was maturing. They read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction with its evocation of the brilliance of the Black radicalism in 19th century America, and they recognized its unmistakable debt to the Black masses of the early 20th century who had produced the Chilembwes, the Garveys, the Lahamine Sedgors. Let me know if I said that correctly. And Simone Kimbangues. And then in 1934 through 35, when the fascist Italian army invaded Ethiopia, the dam burst. Makinen recalled, "It is very important to put the response of the Black world to the Ethiopian War into perspective, especially since it is easy to get the impression that Pan-Africanism was just some type of petty protest activity, a few Blacks occasionally meeting in conference and sending resolutions here and there. But the real dimensions can only be gathered by estimating the kind of vast support that Ethiopia enjoyed amongst Blacks everywhere. We were only one center, the International African Friends of Ethiopia, but the title was very accurate. Letters simply poured into our office from Blacks on 3 continents asking where they could register. And the same was true of Africa. When the Italians entered Addis Ababa, it was reported that school children wept in the Gold Coast. It brought home to many Black people the reality of colonialism and exposed its true nature. They could then see that the stories of Lenin and Trotsky or Sun Yat-sen must have their African counterparts. It was clear that imperialism was a force to be reckoned with because here it was attacking the Black man's last citadel. Within the International African Friends of Ethiopia, however, there was disagreements as to what was to be done. Makinen believed that the collective security of the League of Nations, in parentheses, to which Italy belonged, and paradoxically through Italy, Ethiopia's membership had been accepted, should be invoked, arguing it was a chimera unless fascist Italy was stopped. James, who chaired the IAFE, was ambivalent, however. As an international socialist, he accepted the Independent Labour Party's position that all the British and French capitalists were concerned with was using Ethiopia as a pretext for war to destroying their rivals. The defense of Ethiopia was a mask for the imperialist war. He opposed the League of Nations and the concessions in parentheses, in return for sanctions against Italy, its diplomats had extorted from the emperor, himself a feudal reactionary. As a Black man, however, he had other imperatives. With Garvey in Hyde Park denouncing Mussolini as the arch-barbarian of our times and vigorously arguing Blacks to support Abyssinia. Wait a second. Abyssinia, right? Despite the emperor's infamous reluctance to identify himself as a Black man, with the worldwide popular response among Blacks, James's ground was prescribed. And the quote is, "I offered myself through the Abyssinian army here to take service under the emperor, military or otherwise. My reasons for this were simple. International socialists in Britain fight Britain imperialism because obviously it is more convenient to do so than fight, for instance, German imperialism. But Italian capitalism is the same enemy, only a little further removed. My hope was to get into the army. It would have given me an opportunity to make contact not only with the masses of the Abyssinians and other Africans, but in the ranks with them I could have had the best possible opportunity of putting across the international socialist case. I believed also that I could have been useful in helping to organize anti-fascist propaganda among Italian troops. And finally, I would have had an invaluable opportunity of gaining actual military experience on the African field, where one of the most savage battles between capitalism and its opponents is going to be fought before very many years. I did not intend to spend the rest of my life in Abyssinia, but all things considered, I thought and still think that 2 or 3 years there, given the fact that I am a Negro and am especially interested in the African Revolution, was well worth the attempt. Obviously, James was in conflict, but by early 1936, the situation had resolved itself for the moment. The occupation of Ethiopia was an accomplished fact, and the emperor was in exile in Britain. By the end of the year, however, the Spanish Civil War had begun. Now the entire international left was at war, and blacks from Africa, the Caribbean, and America joined the international brigades to fight against fascist forces in Spain, Germany, and Italy. And some blacks fought for fascism, the Moroccan soldiers, General Franco's stormtroopers. But even before the international brigades were withdrawn from Spain in 1938 through 39, the West Indies exploded into strikes and brutal repression. The world seemed enveloped in struggle, and blacks in the black struggle were a part of that world. For many radicals, an unavoidable lesson of the era was the necessity for armed resistance to oppression and exploitation. That reminds me, Negroes with Guns. I think there's another book on the tip of my tongue. I have a screenshot of it, but we'll come back. But for James, what the Italian army had done to Ethiopia, the killing of tens of thousands of peasants, and the complicity of the bourgeois democracies was instruction enough. Africans and people of African descent, especially those who have been poisoned, I like that word, by British imperialist education, need a lesson. They have got it. Every succeeding day shows exactly the real motives which move imperialism in its contact with Africa, shows the incredible savagery and duplicity of European imperialism in its quest for markets and raw materials. Let the lesson sink deep. The lesson sank deeper than he imagined. His tutorship under European radical thought had come to an end. From this point on, his work would leap beyond the doctrinaire constructions of the anti-Stalinist left and Engels and Marx themselves. The force of the black radical tradition merged with the exigencies of black masses in movement to form a new theory and ideology in James's writing. In James's view, with only the most sporadic support to be expected from European working classes and European left, the radical black intelligentsia was now compelled to seek the liberation of their peoples by their own means. But some of the others with whom he would be associated in the successor of the IAFE, the International African Service Bureau, 1937, did not agree. When Padmore, for example, expressed his own reservations in how Britain rules Africa, James leveled a withering criticism. It is on the future of Africa that the author, himself a man of African descent, is grievously disappointing. Ooh. He heads one section, Will Britain Betray Her Trust?, as if he were some missionary or labor politician. In the true tradition of Lenin, he insists on the right of African people to choose their own development. But astonishingly, he welcomes the appeal of enlightened and far-sighted sections of the ruling classes of Europe with colonial interests in Africa to cooperate with Africans. That is madness. How does the lion cooperate with the lamb? Ooh. Africans must win their own freedom. Nobody will win it for them. They need cooperation, but that cooperation must be with the revolutionary movement in Europe and Asia. There is no other way out. Each movement will neglect the other at its peril, and there is not much time left. He had not forsaken the anticipation of an industrial proletarian revolution, but he had become aware of the existence of a more vigorous black opposition than that with which he was familiar in his own class. In the crushing of the Ethiopian people, he had seen the naked face of Western imperialism. More importantly, however, in Ethiopia, Spain, and the Caribbean, he had witnessed the capacities for resistance of ordinary black people, the transformation of peasants and workers into liberation forces. Right. Unlike Padmore, whose sojourn at the pinnacle of international communism had left him uncertain when he could no longer rely on that source, or Kenyatta and Williams, whose encounters with the imperial and capitalist metropoles so impressed them as to advise caution, James became convinced that successful armed rebellion among black peoples was possible. The colonial struggle and the metropolitan struggle were identical on that score. For a time, this view prevailed. Armed rebellion among blacks became the official position of the IASB. But after 1938, with James away in America on a lecture tour that would last for 15 years, that stand was modified by his associates. The work of the Bureau continued all through the war, and in 1945 there came a sharp break with the theory. The Bureau changed its position from the achievement of independence by armed rebellion to the achievement of independence by nonviolent mass action. And I think about that with the Black Panthers and the Civil Rights Movement, because they worked together. They worked together. You could not have the Civil Rights Movement without the Black Panthers. But I think about the different messaging and why both messaging were required. When I was talking to my grandfather about it, I asked him what was his opinion, and he said that they needed both, or not even just both. They needed all of the different perspectives and tangent. We'll come back to that discussion another time. Because he was alive during then. He was born in 1934, and my grandmother 1935. So they recognized. Excuse me. Anyways, keep going. But to say that is one thing. To carry it out in practice is another. To stake independence upon armed rebellion was therefore to have a precondition. To stake independence upon armed rebellion was therefore to have as a precondition the collapse or military paralysis of the metropolitan government. It was, in other words, to place the initiative for African struggles upon the European proletariat. But by the end of the war, the proletariat of Britain and France had not spoken. Oh, I like these next pages, y'all. Okay. Imperialism still held sway at home. Only a radical alteration in theory could form a basis for action. The perspective of armed rebellion was abandoned, though held in reserve, and non-violent mass action was substituted. While they pinned their hopes on the disintegrative force that war represented for the empires, on the resurrection of liberal ideology expressed by ruling classes made desperate by that war, and on the political consequences of the practical support given by colonials to the imperial countries during the war, James immersed himself in the American Trotsky movement and the struggles of black workers, and he too became reconciled to nonviolent action. And then there's a quote. As a result of the war, of revolutions and crises which had shaken contemporary societies to its foundations for almost 40 consecutive years, the bourgeoisie had lost its self-confidence in the face of a united mass movement. When all is said and done, the new political directive, breaking with the well-established ideas of the pre-war period, is one of the great theoretical achievements of the present age, perhaps the first real break towards what the Marxist movement requires today, the application of the traditional principles of Marxism in complete independence of the Stalinist perversion. It is to be noted that the theory did not reject armed rebellion, but held it in the reserve in the event that the political and moral pressure envisaged envisage, contemplate, or conceive of as a possibility or a desirable future event. Envisaged, envisaged, failed to influence British imperialism, but nonviolent mass action threw the black struggle back into the hands of petite bourgeoisie, albeit a radical petite bourgeoisie. It was they who would mediate between the mass movement and the representatives of imperialism, and neither James nor any of the others ever came to terms with this theoretical error. It was simply the case that the demand for the right of black people to govern themselves, the position adopted at the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, articulated by a radical intelligentsia speaking on behalf of the dominated, would have historical consequences quite different from those that resulted from the black masses seizing their liberation. Nevertheless, James's intervention had been significant. He had made a singular contribution to radical black historiography when he and his comrades in the IASB were mapping out their contending positions in the last years of the third and during the fourth decade of the century. It was then that Padmore had written How Britain Rules Africa, Eric Williams his The Negro in the Caribbean, Kenyatta his Kenya, Land of Conflict, and James the Black Jacobin. The first three had proposed national independence for African peoples, but were addressed to the colonial powers. The fourth, James's work, had not appealed. Instead, it was a declaration of war for liberation. Those black Haitian laborers and the mulattoes who had given us an example to study, the imperialists envisage an eternity of African exploitation. The African is backward, ignorant, they dream dreams. Importante. I put a little right here. The theoretical frame for the Black Jacobin was, of course, the theories of revolution developed by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. James asserted that fact rather frequently in the text. It was not, however, entirely the case. From Marx and Engels, he had taken the concept of a revolutionary class and the economic foundations for its historical emergence. But the slaves of Haiti were not a Marxian proletariat. No matter to James, the process of social formation was the same. The slaves worked the land, and like revolutionary peasants everywhere, they aimed at the extermination of their oppressors. But working and living together in gangs of hundreds on the huge sugar factories which covered North Plain, they were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time, and the rising was, therefore, a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. Page 85 through 86, I think of the Black Jacobin. Moreover, James seemed willing to challenge Marx and Engels on the very grounds they had laid for the sociological and political significance of early capitalism, while they had been content to locate the formation of the modern revolutionary proletariat at the core of While they had been content to locate the formation of the modern revolutionary proletariat at the core of capitalist industrial production, James was insisting that the sphere be broadened. At the same time, this is a quote. At the same time as the French masses, the savage Read the book. um, the half-savage slaves of San Domingo were showing themselves subject to the same historical laws as the advanced workers of the Paris. Page 243. Capitalism had produced its social and historical negations in both poles of its expropriation. Capitalist accumulation gave birth to the proletariat at the manufacturing core. Primitive accumulation deposited the social base for the revolutionary masses in the peripheries. The peripheries are going, like, you know how black people have always been at the margins, at the peripheral? Right. But what distinguished the formation of these revolutionary classes was the source of their ideological and cultural developments. While the European proletariat had been formed through and by the ideas of the bourgeoisie, the ruling ideas Marx and Engels had maintained were the ideas of the ruling class. In Haiti and presumably elsewhere among slave populations, the Africans had constructed their own revolutionary culture. And think about, just think about, let that marinate for a second. European radical thought is going to be grounded in European ideology, Western ideology, compared to black revolt, black revolutionary thought, black anything is going to be grounded in the African ideology, African culture, African cosmos, because right. One does not need education or encouragement to cherish a dream of freedom. At their midnight celebration of voodoo, their African cult, I don't really like that, but I don't like the idea of African cult. They danced and sang usually this favorite song, bomba, hue, kanga, bafio, te, kanga, mune, dele, kanga, do, kila, kanga, li. And then in quotation, we swear to destroy the whites and all they possess, and all that they possess. Let us die rather than fail to keep this vow. The colonists knew this song and tried to stamp it out, and the voodoo cult with which it was linked in vain. And think about the way in which African religions and practices have been, like even hoodoo, have been deemed demonic, bad, evil, when that African spirituality had been the basis of a lot of revolutions, had been that thing that kept everyone together. That, you know what I mean? Voodoo, that's page 18. Voodoo was the medium of the conspiracy. In spite of all prohibitions, the slaves traveled miles to sing and dance and practice the rites and talks, and now sense the revolution to hear the political news and make their plans. Page 86. This was a complete departure from the way in which Marx and Engels had conceptualized the transformative and rationalizing significance of the bourgeoisie. It implied, and James did not see this, that bourgeois culture and thought and ideology were irrelevant to the development of the revolutionary consciousness among Black and other third world peoples. It broke with the evolutionist chain in the closest dialectic of historical materialism, but where James was to hesitate, Cabral, as we have noted before, would stride boldly forward. National liberation, this is a quote, national liberation is the phenomenon in which a given socioeconomic whole rejects the negation of its historical process. In other words, the national liberation of a people's is the regaining of the historical personality of that people. Its return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination in which it was subjected. And then I think about that in relation to Black nationalism. Put a pin in that, and we'll revisit. I made myself a little note so that we can revisit. But James's effort to level Marxist theory to the requirements of black radical historiography was not finished. Though he bore a great respect for the work and thought of Lenin, there too he suggested a more imaginative treatment. With Lenin's notion of a cadre of professional revolutionists, the beginnings of a vanguard party in mind, James went so far to designate an entire stratum, describing in precise terms how it was formed. The leaders of a the leaders of a revolution are usually those who have been able to profit by the cultural advantages of the system they are attacking. Page 19. This was an admission of class pride that neither Lenin nor Marx nor Engels had been prepared to make. Though surely it was an inadvertent admission, one that revealed James's own class origins, it also reflected a certain historical clarity. The petite bourgeois intelligentsia had played dominant roles in Marxist thought as well. Think about that. Finish the sentence. The petite bourgeois intelligentsia had played dominant roles in Marxist thought as well as in the Bolshevik victory in Russia. The theory and the ideology of revolution was theirs, and inarguably to the Russian state. They had brought to. It was not a theory created by the working class. It was a theory by the bourgeois given to the working class. Okay, they had brought to the working class movement their superior knowledge and the political vices which usually accompany it, as James would say of Toussaint Louverture of Haiti, page 95. In San Domingo, the revolutionary masses had found a almost propitious figure in Toussaint Louverture who knew the enemy better than they. That had been one of his rewards as a functionary in the slave system. His post as a steward of the livestock had given him experience in administration, authority, and intercourse with those who ran the plantation. He was like the manager. But think about it. He has an in, right? Men who, by sheer ability and character, find themselves occupying positions usually reserved for persons of a different upbringing, education, and class, usually perform those duties with exceptional care and devoted labor. In addition, he had read C.L.R's commentary, read and reread the long volume by the Abbé Raynal. He had a thorough grounding in the economics and politics not only of San Domingo, but of all great empires in Europe. This is about Toussaint. His superb intellect had therefore had some opportunity of cultivating itself in general affairs at home and abroad. Page 91. But, in the end, Toussaint had failed the revolution. James more than sympathized with some of Toussaint's failures. In a quote, Toussaint knew the backwardness of the laborers. He made them work, but he wanted to see them civilized and advanced in culture. He was anxious to see the blacks acquire the social deportment of the better class whites with their Versailles manners. Page 246. Think about like assimilation, right? Black people have typically been forced in a way to assimilate into this dominant ideology, the dominant culture, and anything that's like black is seen as backward, wrong. You know what I mean? Even though we know that's not the case. Okay. But he also believed that Toussaint was correct in thinking that the propertied whites who remained or returned to San Domingo were needed to help the former slaves construct a modern state. His unrealistic attitudes to the former masters at home and abroad sprang not from an abstract humanitarianism or loyalty, but from a recognition that they alone had what San Domingo society needed. Page 290. This last in almost direct contradiction to his beliefs 30 years later. slaves ran the plantations. Oh, page 290. This last in almost direct contradiction to his beliefs 30 years later. Slaves ran the plantations, those tremendous plantations, the great sources of wealth, and plantations are a form of European imperialism. It would establish European sovereignty on the land, and then the enslaved people would work that land for the profit of the plantation, for the profit of European sovereignty, whatever. Okay. Slaves ran the plantations, those tremendous plantations, the great source of wealth of so many English aristocrats and merchants, the merchant princes who cut such figures in English society, and French too, but we're speaking of English society. Yet others, even more recently, have agreed with earlier James. In 1938, however, James knew that the former slaves, Toussaint's contemporaries, did not agree. When they acted on those beliefs and rebelled against Toussaint because they were no longer willing to accept his egotistical compromises with the colonial bourgeoisie and the Bonaparte regime in France, Toussaint had them hunted down and executed. Page 285. That tragedy, James argued, was because Toussaint explained nothing and allowed the masses to think that their old enemies were being favored at their expense. Page 284. But more importantly, James insisted Toussaint's failure had been the result of events beyond his control. If he had failed, it was for the same reason that the Russian Socialist Revolution had failed, even after all of its achievements, the defeat of the revolution in Europe. Page 283. But James was quite aware that there was much that had been within Toussaint's range and much that he had botched. He seemed to sense that for all the importance that might be rightly placed on the counter-revolution in Europe, and for all the genius that could be ascribed to Toussaint in the early periods of the revolution, there was still something that was terribly wrong in the man's makeup. Indeed, James admitted, Haitian leaders of such narrower experience and education than Toussaint would overcome difficulties that his psychology could not confront. And in the extraordinary series of paragraphs, he tries to reconcile his admiration for the man, for the revolutionary masses that had constructed him, as I would argue in parentheses, and the figures to whom history attached the completion of the Haitian Revolution. These passages, better than most, reveal the sources of James's contradiction in 1938. And here's the quote. We're almost done, y'all. Between Toussaint and his people, there was no fundamental difference of outlook or aim. Knowing the race question for the political and social question that it was, he tried to deal with it in a purely political and social way. It was a grave error. Lenin, in his thesis on the Second Congress of the Communist International, warned the white revolutionaries, a warning they badly needed, that such had been the effect of the policy of imperialism on the relationship between advanced and backward peoples that European communists will have to make wide concessions to natives of colonial countries in order to overcome the justified prejudice which these feel toward all classes in the oppressing countries. Toussaint, you have to be able to talk to people and understand where they're coming from. We'll keep going. Toussaint, as his power grew, forgot that. He ignored the black laborers, bewildered them at every moment that he needed them most, and to bewilder the masses is to strike the deadliest of all blows to the revolution. You have to listen to the people, talk to the people, value what they're saying, value their culture, value who they are as people. You can't just throw them away. You can't just, you know what I mean? That's right. The whites were whites of the old regime. Dessalines did not care what they said or thought. The black laborers had to do the fighting, and it was they who needed reassurance. It was not that Toussaint had any illusions about the whites. He had none whatsoever. Yet Toussaint's errors sprang from the very qualities that made him what he was. Because Toussaint, as we had said, we just read, he's thinking that the black laborers are backwards. He's thinking he wants them to assimilate. That's your error. Why? Why do you want them to assimilate into a excuse me. It is easy to say. It is easy to see today. It is as his generals saw after he was dead. After he was dead, where he had erred. It did not mean that they or any of us would have done better in his place. If Dessalines could see so clearly and simply, it was because the ties that bound this uneducated soldier to French civilizations were of the slenderest. He saw what was under his nose so well because he saw no further. Toussaint's failure was the failure of enlightenment, not of darkness. Pages 286, 287, and 288. Alas, from no less an authority than James himself, we know this last defense of Toussaint was not without an element of rationalization. As Toussaint wasted away in a prison in the Jura Mountains, uh-uh, oh, Jura, the word, it's, Jura, Jura, Yoruh. That's how it's pronounced. Jura Mountains, writing his letters of supplication to the little emperor, his vision gave him away. Despite the treachery of France, he still saw himself as a part of the French Republic, one and indivisible. He could not think otherwise. There was a limit beyond which he could not go. Page 364. We, of course, recognize James and perhaps even his impressions of Padmore in these assertions. We can see the declared identification of a black revolutionary intelligentsia with the masses, the willingness to continue the submission of scientific socialism by denying the material forces of ideology while indicating a bitter disappointment with the communist movement, the patronizing attitude towards the organic leaders of the masses, and the ambivalent pride of place presumed for the Western ideologue. Moreover, it is clear that James was looking critically at his own class. Unlike his Confederates are people that he's working along with. Like, who are, yeah, he was compelled to face up to the boundaries beyond which the revolutionary petite bourgeoisie could not be trusted. For that reason, he was to insist often that the revolutionary masses must preserve to themselves the direction of the revolutionary movement, never deferring to professional revolutionists, parties, or to intelligentsias. But we shall return to that in a moment. Yay! Okay, one more section left. Should we just read it now or no? No. It's only 4 pages, so the next chapter, and then chapter 11, and then chapter 12, and then we're done. And then we have discussions, and then the next book. So I appreciate y'all being here. I appreciate you guys for listening. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.